I think the number one question that I have for you is, you're running what is possibly the most interesting product of our generation, right? Because there's so much that Tinder globally has been able to do. I think the biggest thing has been, and specifically in the Indian context, is removing stigmas around dating, right? And stigmas around, having relationships outside of the person who you marry. What's been the wildest thing that you have learned about Indian customers or just customers at large over the past now almost 8 years of running Tinder?
I think this last sort of 5.5 years that I have been doing this personally, I think it's been quite a journey. It's a ride. It is as fascinating as it sounds, but it's way harder. You have to understand really consumer psyche, and we're really dealing in a category which is about something very personal to you, and it's not, you don't always know what you want. You always don't know where you stand, and your views evolve over a period of time, right? As you get more exposure, you have some preconditioned ideas about love, about relationships, about dating, about the kind of person you are, about the kind of person you would like to be with. And as you get older and as you go through life experiences, as you maybe go through some relationships, you're like, that's actually not true, right? Or I no longer believe in that. Or especially in India, I think a lot of us in 20s and 30s today will relate to being sort of, growing up on a staple diet of Bollywood pop culture, and Mills and Boone and Archie's version, very larger than life, version of what life looks like. And then, being 18 and, imagining, it's always starts at, it kind of ends at happily ever after. Like you say, you get into a relationship and it ends, but life actually begins there. And so what we've seen, the most fascinating thing for me is that our 18-year-olds are so different than our 22-year-olds, are so different than our 27-year-olds, are so different than our 30-year-olds, and so different than our 35-year-olds. And all of them are my audience. And they are so different, there might as well be a generation between each of them. Because that is the speed at which consumer mindset in India has accelerated and changed, especially in this area, but even broadly, right? Like your ideas about career, ideas about what I want from how I spend my money, how I make my life decisions, the role my parents play in my life, what my aspirations and dreams are, what's a dream, all of that has evolved in the last decade, 10 to 15 years. And so different people are at different stages of that. It's a function of age, it's a function of exposure, and many other things. But that's why it's a very complex, very heterogeneous user community. And that's what makes it super fascinating, right? So there is that old proverb about India that anything you can say about India is true, and the absolute opposite is always true. And I think you see that every day, right? So I think it's been, I hear all sorts of amazing user stories, incredible things. I have met people who have met on Tinder and gotten married 8 days later, which to me is crazy. It's just crazy town, and it's nothing short of a Bollywood flick. And I have met people who have found companies together, who have gotten into a relationship and then no, we don't have any chemistry, but we can be co-founders or something else, right? So you just discover so much. And in a country like India in particular, right, we don't talk to strangers. We're very awkward. We're very warm people. Once we know someone, we will welcome you in our house. We have greatest hospitality. We have everything. But until that point at which we know each other, we are very awkward. We don't walk on the street saying hello, right? You're always taught to be very cautious against strangers, right?
I was one of those who, really doubted Tinder's ability to penetrate in India for exactly this reason, right? We're just not taught to there's no sense of small talk, right? Like you said, there's no sense of, saying, hey, how are you? And also, like you absolutely accurately said, there's a lot of, I think everyone looks at the other person with suspicion, right? and especially in the context of like men and women, which in a country like India has its own, complexity. Could you talk to me about how have you seen this user, right? Like this 18 to 24-year-old or whoever who's using Tinder specifically. How have you seen them change over the last 8 years from thinking twice about should I use this, should I not, to now it almost that ability to swipe right, almost becoming second nature to how you even use mobile devices. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's been the most fascinating thing, and I think what wins, and that's been my biggest takeaway, is that the reason any of this has worked is the absolute human desire to connect with another person and to find that companionship or relationship or friendship. Or we are social beings. Men can't, I don't think a man can survive, a human being can survive by themselves on this planet. They could have everything, but the need for human connection is extremely fundamental, is very universal and exists deep down, right? And so online dating has become something that you had rarely ever heard of. There was a lot of fear of unknown. You were like, I don't know who does this, right? Like, is that for me? Does using online dating mean I cannot find someone in real life? Like, what does it say about me? Who are the kind of people that, there were all of these questions that are natural considering how new and strange it was, to a point that over 2/3 of all relationships and first dates for 18 to 30-year-olds in these markets start online. Like over 2/3 today, like, and nearly more than half, so almost 40% actually start on dating apps. And of course Tinder leads it by the widest margin. So it's become how you meet people, right? And there's nothing strange about it anymore. And so it's been fascinating.
And related to that, I think also specifically now that you're managing a larger portfolio within the Match Group, I think what's really interesting about what you guys have been able to do is just own the full stack of companionship, right? So from that 18-year-old use case, who's now using technology like Snapchat, again, like you said, actually when you were talking, the immediate corollary coming to my head was Snapchat, right? Where everything happens with some level of anonymity, so actions needn't necessarily be recorded, so to speak, on the internet or on the cloud. You guys have obviously expanded that use case that you may have begun with to many more diverse products that own a longer sort of like lifetime of a customer's use case of companionship. When you think of the job to be done across each of the different, so for example, like you very interestingly said, Tinder to a large extent is kind of about finding yourself when you're younger, right? It is about seeking those unique experiences that help you to some extent, exaggerated or not, shape your own identity. When you think of the job to be done for, say, products like OkCupid and Hinge, which obviously are for a very different use case and a customer with a very different intent than, say, a Tinder customer, could you help me understand two things? One, as someone who's managing all of these diverse products, how do you compartmentalize what kind of approach to have for what product? And also from a customer's perspective, how have you seen the same single customer adapt to different products as in how their use case changes?
So I would say, I think on this approach of having a portfolio, I think it's still relatively very early days in India, right? And we're still building it out. And if you look at what Match Group's done globally, and you look at mature markets where online dating and matchmaking is at least a couple of decades, if not more, older than India, you would figure out that the vision that unifies everything and matches, that we help people form connections online, right? To spark those connections. We see ourselves as almost the introducer and the facilitator. And that vision of connections is fairly broad. It's specific, but it's broad. And there are various kinds of especially in the one-to-one connecting domain, right? It's not like a many-to-many connection. There are various different people have different uh, needs, and different products are more efficient for you at different points in time, right? We don't actually track what any user, and each of our brands operate absolutely independently, and they actually compete with each other to some extent as well, and that's fine. It's only at the board level and at corporate level that you have some common leadership, but they all operate completely independently of each other. So in the Tinder's headquartered in Los Angeles, OkCupid's headquartered in New York. Like they're all like completely different teams. But as Match Group, we feel like okay, we can understand their market as a whole, what people across the country, across the world are looking for, and what are different product and user experiences that they would want, that would fill in the gaps, that would suit them better. So I think that's kind of the way we think about it.
So, like you said, Match Group specifically is a global company, right? And you're obviously adapting all these products to the local, Indian context. So 2 questions over there. And let's, begin with the first. How have you localized the product itself, right? Or like the use case of all the different products, sub-products within the larger umbrella of Match Group? How have you localized Tinder, Hinge, OkCupid, etc. in the Indian context? And again, not just in terms of community building and marketing, but even from a product perspective, right? If you could talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I will not go too much into specifics, but I would just say that, as I said, right, there is each team works independently, and they work with the product teams in the global marketing teams and operations teams together to figure out what works for that best user experience and what would Indian users want. Obviously, there are certain common traits in what Indian users want, but I genuinely we run it independently, and the idea is for us to reflect the best we can, and it's never done and it's never perfect and it's a work in progress, and again user needs are evolving, so just to best capture their behavior, their needs, their features. So like an example is when before we launched OkCupid, we spent so OkCupid basically is built on trying to understand you better. So it will have OkCupid is a database of 3,000 questions which have been scientifically designed, and there's a machine learning, there's an algorithm which kind of figures out who you are, what kind of person you want, and finds surfaces people who would be compatible to you. And it takes into account several things as to what aspects are important to you. Yeah, you may have an opinion about everything on earth, but there are only 3 things on which like that really matter to you. And so OkCupid's philosophy is that we'll match you on what really matters to you. And so we will spend the time to get to know you. And we'll obviously, and that's a process that keeps evolving. And so in fact, even to sign up, you have to answer like 15 questions. You don't complete your profile without that. And that takes like some time investment on your part. But then when we started, in the beginning itself, we spent a lot of time figuring out, okay, which of these questions don't make sense for Indian users? What are the questions that would? And so we adapted that at the very beginning. And then we have constantly tweaked and iterated that process and added more things. We've seen how users behave, what aspects are they connecting on, what surfaces more, what is making for it matters. And so it's a learning process, which makes us evolve their experience. So that's just an example. And there are several things that we keep doing. I cannot speak to super specifics on each of these products, but it's a constant, that's the job, understanding your user and add value to their lives.
So speaking of understanding your users, right? Obviously, you're married. You're evidently not a user of Tinder, OkCupid, or Hinge in their more obvious sort of like use cases. And obviously, I know as a founder running a company, and as a GM running a company, the emotion associated with the product are usually largely different, yeah. Right? So for you and for your team, and especially given how varied India is, from a tier 1 to a tier 2 to a tier 3 city, could you talk about what are the mental models or the frameworks that you use to understand this user better, to not project your bias, on this user across, again, all products, or maybe just, from the vantage point of the GM of Match India?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is to question your assumptions at all points of time, right? Like, and being aware of your biases is very, very important. Right? As I said, I think I said this before, that today's 18, 19-year-olds are very different even from 25-year-olds. Forget 33-year-olds like me, right? So the biggest mistake you can do is assume that their life truth would be the same as what yours was with him when you were 18 years old or 19 years old. I was in college, I didn't feel the need for it, so why would these users, right? And I think being super aware of it and keeping yourself honest is number one. And we kind of write that and question ourselves, and you have to assume you don't know anything, and that's the only way you will get forward. We obviously invest a lot in like talking to consumers, in just researching not just our users, but like people at large, and we learn a lot from those kind of formal processes. But also, if you think about it, every day in your business you make decisions. You need to you develop a certain judgment. You can call it instinct. You almost know by instinct this will work or this doesn't make sense. But really, instinct is a sum of experience and some of judgment, and all the good judgment comes from past judgment, bad judgment also at some point. So I think this idea of keeping yourself honest, never getting super arrogant, knowing when we are trying things and like experimenting it, and then watching, okay, what will tell us. I think the one question I ask my team almost anytime they come back with saying this is what we should do, is how would you know if this worked? Like, once you have done this, at the end of that project, what would success look like? Right? And it is sometimes more obvious in product decisions than it is in marketing, but I think it's true both ways, right? In product, you're like, okay, these are the metrics we are going to see, right? And sometimes having that conversation makes you realize the 5 other metrics that you're not including in that, right? Maybe there's a trade-off somewhere. Maybe something will happen as a second order consequence or third order consequence that you should be tracking. And so having that conversation upfront is very important. In marketing even more so, because you're trying communication, you're trying branding. Sometimes it's not always obvious about what happened because you did a certain thing, but it adds up. So asking this question helps you say, okay, if it is good, I will see it, and it could be qualitative things, but if this works, I will see XYZ. I will have, and it could be as random as I will have 3 people who I know call me or text me saying we saw this and it was good. Because if it was good, eventually there is enough conversation about it, it will reach back to me. And it's completely random and completely anecdotal, but you know that what happens. And when it is obviously bad, you kind of always know it, right? Obviously bad, you don't need to think about it. It will bomb in your face, and you will know about it. And thankfully, and hopefully that never happens. But like, those are the obvious ones. The hard ones are like the mediocre stuff. Like you don't know if it was really good enough or incremental. So we force ourselves to have that conversation, and we have misses, or when we think of, okay, why didn't this do as well? So if you have that conversation honestly and just ask the question without giving in the temptation to answer it every single time immediately, right? You don't have to come to me if you're working with me or somebody who's leading the project as the know-it-all who knows all the answers. But you have to come to me having thought through about it, that these are the questions. Maybe these are a few hypotheses or possible answers, but I don't know. And I don't know is a very, very, very good answer, because it's intellectual honesty, and it forces you to, okay, let's go ask. Let's go find out, right? And so I think that what has worked for us, because if you really think about it, as I was saying, the speed at which this country and this market and this category has changed, right? The speed at which it has grown, and with scale, any business when it scales, the nature of problems and the nature of consumer behavior evolves. My early adopters look very different than the users who are downloading, or then at least half of the users who will download Tinder today. And they're coming in assumptions and experience and expectation may be different, and so their behavior will be different. So this thing of de-aggregating data, where it is data driven, asking these questions, these pieces are very important. I often joke that this job makes me feel like a dinosaur. I feel very old. Like I don't know the last time when you talk to a few 20-year-olds and you're like, I don't follow this conversation. And
Oh man, my brother's 20, 21. So like every conversation with him, I'm just like, man, there's like a generational divide in between. Absolutely, or spot on.
Exactly. And so, you feel old, but like you have to do that to challenge yourself, right? And some of it is like, immersing yourself into their conversation. What do they care about? Then there's endless amounts of time that goes into popular, social media and pop culture, just research, absorbing, and sometimes it's like baffled. What are people doing? But if you don't know, you can't do anything about it, right? So it is extremely fascinating. It's a learning exercise, especially when you're building a B2C lifestyle product. This is not a utility product. We don't grow with discounts. We don't grow with saying, today there is big billion days, and therefore if you date today, it is 30% off. That doesn't work. I cannot tempt you to date. I cannot change your mind, right? And that's not the intent, right? So this is a B2C lifestyle driven tactic. If you want to use my product, you will. The day you stop using it, you will go. There is nothing that stops you, right? And so to build a business like that, you are really figuring out the real motivations of your consumers. And so it starts with understanding who they are, all 100,000 types of them, like big city, small city, age, education, exposure, every axis you can think of, understanding their motivations, figuring out what they want, and then try, and it's always try, you never succeed fully, to add value to their life in some way. Because ultimately, I think in all business, if you consistently add value, eventually you will be able to capture part of that value for yourself, and that's what builds the business. If you try to capture everything, or if you try to capture it too quickly, it will usually not work. So if you just focus on that step one, I want to improve this experience, I want to add value, and there is always things we can do. Everything else falls in place.
So could you give an example, right? So maybe, if you could talk about, say, like a marketing activity that you've done, or maybe, like a product feature that you launched, which really helped you unlock this creation of desire, right? Because like you correctly said, you're at the end of the day selling a lifestyle brand, and a lot of that desire needs to be created, right? Or manufactured, even if it's through pop culture or, whatever else. Could you give an example of things that, you've done either in India or globally that have really been able to get this done?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's not necessary. Again, we can't manufacture your desire. What we can do is, if that intent exists, and as I said, superhuman intent, especially in the world we live in, right? Loneliness is an epidemic. It's we all have it. We all crave different connection, and especially in Indian context, especially if you talk about Indian women, wanting that choice and control and freedom and agency of your own life is such a deep motivator that we don't manufacture anything. However, what you can do, and what we have, in some ways focused on doing, especially for the first several years, was, solving for the fears and the barriers, right? Like this thing of, what is this? Can this even happen? All the fear of unknown, everything that comes from something that's new, right? And as I said, our best advocates are our consumers and our members themselves. So I think the one thing that we have focused on doing, again, the one strength we have, if you think about it, is the fact that people talk about their Tinder dates on their, at the water cooler in their office. It's lunch table conversation. It's something that you tell your friends about, right? And tons of brands would kill to be part of that conversation, right? And Tinder's always been blessed to be a part of culture and lifestyle. Like, that's what people are talking about us. In some ways, and again, when people talk to you about it, they will tell you about the weird date they had, the funny date they had, the amazing date they had, the bad date they had, and usually you don't hear the vast majority of stories as much, which are good and very good. and very interesting. Like, those are the ones that you hear less about. The more unique and outliers one you will hear more. And in some ways, our job initially was to say, hey, was to just amplify these stories, right? Put, like, our users are our best advocates. So the face to our brand should be our users, not us, right? And so we would, every time we talk to users, we'd ask them, would you want to share your stories? And once in a while, someone would say yes, and we would help amplify that. And we would, the biggest trust comes from, okay, he's using it, she's using it, he's using it, she's using it, and this is what they did, this is what they did, this is what's possible, this is what's possible, this is an experience someone else had. And just because they're real, they're authentic, they are examples of illustrations of what's possible. It tells you that, hey, I can do it too, or why didn't I think of that, or this is relatable, or if it can happen for them, it can happen for me, or I am looking for this, maybe I'll go for Tinder to find it out, right? And they do when they try, and I think, and then they try and they navigate, and then we're all set, because they are very quickly, they will learn to navigate the product experience and make what they want of it, right? You swipe left on whatever you don't want to connect with, and it's very easy, it doesn't even take a second, right? And you swipe right on what you want, and so you're only opening yourself up to things that you want. So you're moving forward in a direction that's completely of your own choice, your own making, and at all points of time you can choose to move forward or move back, withdraw consent, explore, and so you get so much control that then we're set. So I think that's been and we've done this over the years, like many ways, like lots of marketing and communication would have focus on bringing that piece out and just amplifying the reality of what's happening on the product, and actually telling all the good stories and the great stories, because you'll hear the really weird ones by itself. You don't need my help.
I think another secret sauce that you guys have, which doesn't get talked about enough, is how lean your team is, right? And I want to get into that because I think globally you guys are 400 people. I think in India you guys are sub 10 people, if I'm not mistaken, which is unheard of, right? Especially given the scale of operations, that you have, the number of users you have, and the communities that you've been able to build. How do you make that happen? How do you take less than 10 people and build, a world-class company, product, etc. within India itself?
Yeah, so I think, so Tinder is less than 500 people globally. OkCupid, Hinge, both less than 100 people. Most of our teams are like that. I think and so in India, we now just reached 10 across brands and functions. And it seems like, but for the longest time, we were like 3 of us and 4 of us for the longest time building this. I would say a few things there. One is, I think team size, first of all, is a function of the nature of business you're in, right? So it's about your business model. And so by itself, it isn't, a great thing or bad thing. By itself, it doesn't say that you're successful. You can have 1 million people and be very unsuccessful in some ways, or have a very poorly performing business, and you can have a great one at like 100, right? So I think it's a function of operating model. Now, we do not have a very operationally intensive business. I don't have grocery delivery and cabs and all of that. So when the more operationally intensive your business is, the more 24/7 it is, the more you need people to sort of run for the business to run. It's like a shop. If your shop is open, you're in business. If you shut down the shop, it's not doing any business. Versus the great advantage of software, not all software, but most software is, it works. We can all be sleeping. The entire company can be sleeping, but the business would work. And yes, you still need to sort of, there are some, there's care and there's DevOps, and there are still some essential functions, but 80% of the company can be on leave on a day. But the business would still function. The users can still experience your product. You still make revenue out of that. So we're blessed in a way to, work with a product and a business model where it's possible. Now, building lean teams when your operating model allows is a great leverage, right? Like if you can do it, it basically means that you don't have to focus a lot of your energy on managing people, because at some point, the more people you have, You need people to manage people. You need processes to manage people. You need a whole thing to run that apparatus. And again, that's necessary in most businesses. But the more people you have, the more complex that piece of having the org work. And ultimately, all companies are just people, right? Like there's a bunch of people who work together. So leadership always has to align and motivate and get everybody working in the same direction. And it's easier to get 3 people to work in the same direction, generally speaking, than 300 and 30,000, right? So I think that's obviously a strong leverage when you can do it. Doing it is hard. Finding the right person, right people, and each new employee is like when we were a team of 4, like you can imagine, each person is 25% of your team. Therefore, it's 25% of your capacity on execution, and they're also 25% of your culture, right? Each person brings their own work style and beliefs and values and everything, and that impacts the team culture. So how do you build a strong culture in small teams, becomes a thing in itself. We've been lucky. We've had some great people work with us for years. We've added a few new folks to our team in the last several months as well as we continue to expand. But it's still a small team that knows each other, that learns from each other. And the great advantage of this is that each of them has a ton of impact personally, a ton of room to grow. A lot of ability, they literally see what they do personally out with millions of users. They grow leaps and bounds every few months because the nature of challenges and the nature of responsibility that you get thrown at you is so vast, right?
If you could talk to me about, what your management style has been, because like you said, when you've got just a room full of less than 10 people and people who are highly competent, who want a lot of ownership, who don't want everything to be broken down for them, that obviously morphs your management style, right? And that morphs, to a large extent, your ability to, impose your thoughts and views on these people versus, take as much from them and then dispel that through the different layers that you work with, right? How has your management style changed? And what is a leader, who's got such a tight-knit team of sub 10 people? What are the do's and don'ts, at your level, specifically with a team that's that tight-knit?
I think, it depends on, each person will have their own natural style. And then so you first need to be super self-aware of what it is. And then what your strengths and weaknesses. And then you can't change too much of it because you can't. But you can, if you know your gaps and blind spots, you know what to actively try to mitigate or grow into and so on. So I think that's the first do for any leader. Like, know yourself. Do you get anxiety by last minute things or not? Are you a planner or not? Are you somebody who doesn't mind being called at 11 p.m. for work because you are going to do that to your team, right? And you may, because that's going to become your instinct, and that may not be something that you have to guard yourself against, right? Or you find, and I would ideally say guard yourself against. Then the easy thing is to find 5 other people who are also okay with it, but the easy thing is to guard yourself against. So I think the first do is knowing yourself, right? And your working style, and your gaps. So like, my natural style is XYZ, and then here are the 3 things that either I hire for, right? So I don't like micromanaging, and I don't like going into the last detail of everything. And so I would want some people in the team, for example, who are very detail oriented and will go into the last detail, and I trust them, right? Because I can, when I need to, go through the last detail. I'm an engineer. Every engineer can do that to some extent, but it's not my natural style. And my natural preferences, I'll do the big picture and I'll do 80-20, and I will get into the details only of the things that matter or which are top of my agenda. But I need someone else who will do that for everything else, right? Because at the time you want a certain quality of work going out. So it's about knowing your own strength. That's an example. It could be anything else. If you don't like, if last minute stuff gives you panic and you're a planner, then you set expectations with your community, with your team, you set deadlines accordingly and all of that, and then don't intervene. So those are important, because your stress will get down to your team instantly. There are not a lot of buffers. In large companies, if you are like a founder or a CEO, you probably don't interact with most of your employees on a daily basis, right? You probably interact with 7 or 8 people on a regular basis, and maybe another 30 on a more periodic basis, and maybe the rest of them you see on town halls and whatever. Like, it's very likely. So your stresses and your mood swings and your worries and all of that don't necessarily go down to the last employee, right? It's buffered within a very small circle. That doesn't happen when you're sitting in the same room with 7 or 8 people. So your stresses and your quirks and all of that are going to show, right? So, and in some way, and so you have to know that, what, at this point, either is going to show, and you've had an you know your team enough, and there is enough sort of an honest conversation that you know how to manage that without it being negative, or this is the time I will pack up and go home, right? Or I will work out of somewhere else. So you have to have that self-awareness, and I think that's very important. People completely underestimate how much stress gets created in orgs from top. And it happens in every org, right? The ex-CEO will say something, the next layer will interpret it in a certain way, add their own buffer to it, transmit it down and all of that. And it creates a lot of the daily sort of stress of work. And sometimes it creates a lot of unnecessary work in companies, because every layer adds their own value, and you sort of have the more junior people working on, actually not just the junior people, even middle management, working on a lot of things that actually are not really that. So that's the other piece. I think then the next piece is, and again, that I would strongly recommend is having a strong culture of honesty in your team, because when you have such a small team, you by definition are empowering them. You are trusting their judgment. A lot of them are going to go out and do things, and they stand in for you, right? That you're not going to codify every single process, so to speak, because you don't even know what it is. So the values and the decision making protocols and the how do we work with each other and how do we brainstorm things, the hows become more important. And spelling them out matters, right? So for me, there are two ways people have trust models. You can either be a person who, when you meet someone new, you're like, I don't trust you because I don't distrust you, but I don't trust you today. And over a period of time, you have to earn my trust, right? As you get to know me, and you will get my trust, and I will sort of give you more and more. That's one way of working. The other, which is what my model is on day one, I will give you a certain amount of trust. And I trust your judgment. I have done my questioning when I hired, whatever, and now I am trusting you, and it's yours to lose, right? So I don't like micromanaging and all that, and I'll say that very clearly, and it's yours to lose. And of course you can get at a higher level, but the default level of trust and respect that you're going to get with me is very high. That's my personal work style. There's no means to say that's the only one. But whatever it is, right, you need to know what it is. You need to communicate what it is. You need to set expectations, right? Like in my team, I think every time I hire someone new, I at least repeat for 6 months to them, if not more, that you don't have to agree with everything I say. If you disagree, speak up. If you have a point of view that's different, fight me. I don't mind a fight. I don't mind an argument. You can absolutely say, Taru, this is bullshit. What are you talking about? Or I have a different point of view. Then reason it out. Then defend it. Let's have an argument. But you shouldn't come in walking, assuming that, she said it. She's my boss. So I just have to follow. And that's very important, because I've hired smart people for a reason, A. B, I can't think for all of them. And C, I will miss stuff, right? There is just blind spots and perspectives. So for me, that's very important. And it's, no matter how many times I say it, it takes at least 6 months for me to repeat it, because that's not a culture people are used to in most companies, where you say, where you will fight and walk out of the room over your boss, right? But I'm okay with that. And so those are the things. What I would seriously ask people not to, if you're building off a small team like that, whatever your culture codes are, whatever your values are, setting them down early, having that honest conversation and reinforcing that by example in your team meetings and all is very important. I think those are my big ones. Again, beyond that, it's really up to each of us. You have to be honest and authentic to who you are. And I'm still learning. I've only been doing this 5 years. still don't think I know anything about managing teams, and sometimes I feel like it's a therapist's job, and sometimes I feel like it's I don't know, motivational coach jobs, and sometimes you have to be like captain of a ship. Like you have to have different days. There are days on which you have to force decisions and say that's it, this we are doing, and there are days on which you are sort of deliberately being unstructured and letting conversations veer off into different directions. So it's a lot, and I am by no means there yet.
I was going to ask, you obviously took on the reins of Tinder specifically when you were quite young. Still young. Thank you for that correction. Yes, still very young. For me, I recently turned 30, and I think only now I'm figuring out what my style is, right? Because it, like you correctly said, it takes certain milestones for you to also understand what self-awareness means and looks like, right? When you reflect on your own journey, and not to sound like motivational coach or therapist about this, but when you reflect on your own journey, and you've had like a remarkable journey, right? IIT, HPS, BCG, Sequoia. You've worked at the most prestigious places. I'm sure worked with large teams, small teams, etc. How have you mapped your own evolution, and when you think of the things that worried you when you were 26, 27 at the helm of this, and the things that worry you now, how has that changed?
In some levels, it hasn't changed. At that time, I worried I know nothing. I still worry I know nothing. So it hasn't changed. You feel as silly. I think, I said personally, I think a couple of things. I'm the kind of person who really prioritizes like learning and personal growth. And it has to be challenging and hard. So the day this job gets easy, I'll quit. It hasn't so far. It's a very challenging job, so I'm fine. But that's the kind of person I am. Like, so I will always optimize for learning and taking the risk, throwing myself out there. I hadn't before this job ever managed a team, done an operating role, or done any marketing or any communication. So I hadn't done like 80% of what my job today is. I had done strategy before. I am very good with numbers. I understand product to some extent, and things like that. But a lot of what I was getting into, I had no idea about. Plus dating, I had no idea about. But it was fascinating to me. Like the scale of the problem was like, okay, I was like, you know what? It is like having your own company. It was a small product. I was the only person in India when I started this, and I was the only person outside of LA for Tinder, working on this. So like there was no playbook, there was no rules, and so that's exciting. And so for me at that time, I think just the intellectual challenge of figuring out product market fit, right? All that theory not theory, but like the second hand view you get when you're an investor, right? Or when you're studying, in business school, or when you're like running somebody else's company and giving them advice. Like it's not the same as being at a driving seat. And so I was like, I want to try it out, to be honest. So I was like, let me see, and maybe I'll fail, and so what, right? Like I'll learn something. And from that point on, I was the only person. I was like literally doing everything from like, how do I make a creative on mine? What do I like writing the first narrative, talking to the product team to understand how this works. Like literally the first steps of like what this is, figuring it out. Or there's no playbook, no rules to follow. Tinder had like 50 people at that time. As I said, I was the only person looking at anything international, and India is as far away from US as it gets on like culture on this. So I was like, we'll figure it out, right? And so obviously a lot has evolved. My understanding has evolved. It is still, as I would say, there's still lots to learn and unlock and figure out. But that has evolved. I hadn't managed a team directly, and so figuring out what my own management style was has evolved. And again, the honest feedback on that only my team can give. I don't know, and maybe they have suffered through a lot of things, but a lot of them stuck around for a lot of time. So like I'm grateful for that. And I have seen us as a team evolve, us as a working culture evolve, each of us as individuals evolve. What we are capable of doing today, individually and together, we couldn't in February 2016, like, or whatever, even in January 2017. None of us could have done that, right? So to me, that piece is gratifying. Looking at how far we've come, and also knowing how much potential there is, because the more you understand, the more you realize that, hey, there are 100 million singles in India who have a smartphone over 18, actually between 18 to 30. They all want to meet people. When you talk to people in these small cities and like very like little towns, and them using Tinder and them having their own take on it, and you hear them in their own unfiltered way, it tells you how much is there to be done. It's very invigorating, and you evolve. And from a management and a leadership perspective, I have learned a lot. I have changed. Again, my self-awareness has grown. When I remember when I started my first job, my boss used to say, she has so much spunk. Like, she's smart, but she has so much spunk. Because I would just say things like, I wouldn't care who's in the room, there's a senior partner, and I would just say whatever came to me. I had no sense of, and to some extent I'm still like that. I'm very direct.
You're preaching to the choir. I just want to say.
I was like that, right? And of course, I have evolved and figured out what are effective ways to communicate. And again, I am not there yet. I would be a better communicator, I am sure, in 10 years from now than I was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But communicating to different stakeholders, whether it's your team, your vendors, your partners, your bosses, stakeholders. Like, I today work with teams across the globe as Match Group, right? So different teams, different products, different folks in the corporate team, like all sorts of different sort of stakeholders across the group. I don't report to most of them. I don't have a direct structured relationship with most of them. They're all from different cultures, and both from a ethnicity as well as like company culture background, all of that. And so I have to change my communication and style to each of them, which is a learning curve of its own. And I have to figure that out. At the same time, with your team, you have, you bring in new folks and they have a different working style than you, and you have to, for me, they have to enjoy their job, right? I want them to enjoy their job, and you only enjoy your job. Enjoying your job basically means you don't wake up on Monday and like, oh shit, Monday, oh my God, I have to go to work, and I'm only doing this because I get money or whatever. Like, if you dread your job on a Monday, then it's a problem. You're not going to last very long, and you're not enjoying your job if you're not growing in it. So I speak to each of them every 3-6 months, and I'm like, okay, what is it that you're doing well? What is it that you're struggling at, right? And I believe that you must be struggling at least 20% of your job in some ways. It has to be new and challenging, and you shouldn't. And at the same time, you have to be comfortable with at least 50% of your job, which you're like, I can do this in my sleep, and that's the right mix. And you do that, and in 6 months, that 20%, like some of that will move into the comfortable zone, and there will be less pieces in your day-to-day that you're struggling at, and that's for me time to give you a new challenge, right? So that I add more things on your plate, I add your scope, I start asking you more strategic questions or whatever it is.
Just being able to give your team another milestone, right? Another, like, keep moving the goalpost. But and I love the ratio that you gave, right? 50% should be okay, I can do it in my sleep. But then just making sure that there's a 20% kicker. I absolutely love that. Okay, I've taken up a lot of your time. I'm going to end this with 2 quick questions for you. The first one is, you said you're a vociferous reader. What is the one book or books or podcasts or whatever that you think anyone building a brand must read?
I think you should, if you're building a brand, you should do 2 things: pick fiction and read fiction, because it opens up your imagination, and read about human behaviors. There are lots of good books that like Sapiens, and there are tons of other good ones which will get into core human behavior and motivations. I think the tons of good ones, you can pick any of those. But I strongly recommend fiction, because we all absorb too much business content anyway on our newspapers and Twitter feeds and podcasts, and you will do that. But if you're building a brand, particularly, you want to open your imagination, give your mind, your right side of like your brain, some breathing space. So I recommend some of that. It opens creativity up.
And the last question for you, which is, what is one Indian brand that you love and you recommend and you think everyone should go check them out?
There are tons of them. India has had a great marketing history, right? So I mean, I don't have a favorite per se, but I think growing up, I was always a fan of like Amul, Esther Lamb. For their again, it's insight. It's they defined moment marketing before social media existed, before topical was a thing, ability to have a take and say something. And so I think I've always loved how they build the brand and the love they have. There are tons of like new in the last few years. There are lots of D2C businesses that have come up and lots of direct to consumer brands that have been built. Too many to have a favorite, but lots of them. And it's you would realize. I think my favorites are the ones that take the time to understand their consumer and build for them and their psyche. And I think I don't have a favorite, but there are lots and lots of them.
Thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I think my biggest learning from this has been I think one way of looking at Match Group and specifically at what Tinder does is sort of like making it seem frivolous and saying, oh, it's dating, right? But actually what you said, and I made a note of it while you were speaking, is I think that the biggest problem with us desis is we are not taught how to control our own outcomes on day one. Everything is sort of like everything from your education system to your parents wanting you to become doctors, engineers, or whatever, right? Like everything is kind of like put down to the T. And I think, through your product and through your work, if you can give us very regimented desis a chance to open our own mind's imagination, that really is what it is, man. And I think the second you look at it from that lens, you actually realize two things, the impact and the potential. So all the best. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been incredible. I hope this was easy, fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Suchita.
Awesome. Thank you, Taru. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.